Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Brenda J. Today we have David Ruybalid on the show. I thought I would take the introduction because I was pretty sure Karen wouldn't be able to pronounce the name. David is a Trauma Informed Theologian, pastor, worship leader, spiritual abuse survivor advocate, speaker, and co-host of Evolution of Faith podcast. David helps in faith renewal and religious trauma-informed recovery, and his expertise extends to guiding victims towards healing. So welcome to the show, David.
Thank you so much. I've been excited about this.
Yes, we're excited.
Yeah,
here.
Definitely.
So this is Karen. It's nice to officially meet you.
Yeah.
So Brenda and I started researching your work and can see how you're helping so many who struggle with spiritual abuse and the anxiety and mental trauma it causes. We also see you have a blog, a website, and a YouTube channel. Do you want to start out by telling a little of your story and how it led to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in the church, and I was born and raised in Colorado Springs. If you know much about kind of church culture and who's publishing all the books and content and curriculum and all the different Bible societies and ministries, a lot of them are just founded there in Colorado Springs. So I was raised kind of in that world. I went to one of the most prominent Christian schools on what they call the Front Range, which is from like Wyoming down to New Mexico. And in that, there were a lot of like Christian celebrities, kids that I was raised around. I was raised around kids that were in like Adventures in Odyssey, which was a focus on the family type audio drama. And that was a world in which I was raised in. But the church that I attended was kind of a step up from there. It was kind of cultish in the way in which it functioned. If you've seen, there's a couple different documentaries out right now about like Bill Gothard and like Let Us Pray is out on Max. Shiny Happy People's the one that most people know. And that's the world in which I was raised in. And so it was an environment that was very authoritarian, very abusive, but also in that I was sexually abused. And so because of that, I carried that through my life. Even after I left that church, I think trying to figure my faith out, I always almost looked at kind of a method of doing church that I wasn't doing or that seemed that maybe hurt me. I always looked for another one as if it was like an institutional messiah. So I hopped around different denominations and styles of worship and stuff for so many years. And then when I tried Bible college, and when I was there, I had a ton of questions about faith, and I started to pick apart the things the professors was saying, and it put me into kind of a tailspin of what I believed and what I didn't believe. And if you fast forward, I was married, and I was 25 years old, and I was in San Jose, California. And I was serving at a church, talking to one of the worship team members, and I was there with our lead pastor, and there was a conversation where I realized in that moment, as I was hearing the story from this individual, that his story was very similar to my story, but I kind of saw myself in him 30 years down the road from where I was. And his marriage was struggling. He had walked through sexual abuse, all kinds of stuff. And I went back, I told my lead pastor, he was the first person I told that I was abused, and he put me in counseling. They paid for 2 years of counseling for me. And I began to realize there that it was a mixture of, yes, kind of the intellectual side, the theological side that I was wrestling with. Of course, that's part of it. But the other part was trauma. There was something in me that when I walked into religious spaces, my nervous system was telling me, you're not safe now, question all the things. And so that was kind of the start of me piecing all that together and walking forward to seek healing. Now, healing, as you know, is not something linear. It's not going to like all of a sudden be fine and you'll be at 100 the next day. It's been something that I've had to walk through since then and continually come to new realizations of other things that need to be healed and worked on. And there's been a couple seasons in my life past that. Of all things, as I walk that road, I've been called into the pastoral ministry, which of all things for a victim of religious abuse doesn't seem to make sense, but God seems to use it in whatever way he wants to use it. And in that, there's been seasons where the last church I was at before I was here, it was in California, and I experienced abuse from the congregation as a pastor.
Oh, wow.
And just having that sent me in another tailspin for a season where I was questioning things, but then coming to new revelations about why I was responding internally and externally the way I was. So it's been kind of a self-revelation as I've walked through a lot of this stuff myself. And because of that, I realized that as a pastor, and before that, I was a worship pastor, and I've done work in Christian schools, and I was an adjunct professor at a Christian university. I found there's not a lot of language to help people understand environments and toxic environments and why they're experiencing what they're experiencing, because it's confusing, because oftentimes there's a God type element or a faith type element attached to what they're walking through that is honestly harmful. So,
yeah. Wow, that's interesting. I can relate to so much of what you said. And I spent a summer living in Colorado Springs when I worked at Focus on the Family that summer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I helped greet people when they would come into the Welcome Center. And then I also, so I know that whole experience. And, I used to think so highly of Focus on the Family. Not that I think they're totally bad now, but I don't think as highly of them now as I used to, just because of the things I disagree with on them. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, we have a couple podcasts on the Bill Gothard stuff with Lauren Rose.
Yeah.
And then one with another
with Allison and the cult. She was
with Allison. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she grew up with the Bill Gothard homeschool.
Yeah.
I understand, because I come from a cult environment. My ex-husband was a pastor that started a cult. So it was never got too big, because my kids and I knew that it wasn't right. Like God did spare us of that. But it is so hard to heal. It is, because there aren't words to put to it.
Yeah.
And people don't understand it's different than just regular trauma.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because you've got, he was domestically abusive, emotional, verbal, and spiritual. And I guess my own healing journey is my own healing journey, because it doesn't make sense. And so.
Yeah.
What I would say, if I could add a little bit, is I would say that, a lot of times when people don't understand, they feel like, oh man, he just, or they or she, just have an axe to grind. That's kind of what they think. They're like, and it's confusing, because they're not in your body, and therefore they don't understand. And it's unfortunate for victims that walk through this stuff.
Yeah,
it definitely is.
I listened to a podcast today. Probably heard of Lori Ann Thompson. I think that's her name, but she's one of the first ones that came out after Ravi Zachariah. She was abused by him. And so I don't know, it was such an intense podcast, because he was such a professional, like everyone looked up to him. And a lot of people, it took a long time for the church to wake up to that. That was one of the first, to me, major scandals. And hearing what she said about her experience, it was just, I don't know, I'll have to find the name of the podcast, because it was really amazing to listen to her testimony.
Yeah. And we are so sorry to hear about your sexual abuse. That's horrible.
Yeah.
And we're so sorry.
Yeah. And in those circles, or the circles I was in, but also just, I think Christianity as a whole, because of all the shame that's wrapped around sexuality and purity and stuff, you just, nowhere to go to. And outside of religious trauma, childhood trauma, you could simply define it as kids having to process big things that they don't have tools for alone.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what a part of my story is, unfortunately. Yeah.
Especially when God's wrapped up in all that, because that's when it's hard to sort what was God and what isn't, because church is always linked with that. That's what it's supposed to represent. So it causes a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
Hopefully you speaking up can really help others that won't, or are afraid to.
I hope so. I don't know if you were seeing some of the stuff this last go around. This last go around, I stood with a friend of mine whose husband is high profile against her abuser, who's kind of high profile this last week. And it was brutal.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's some of that same stuff of like, and what it was after talking with them, like, they're surprised no pastors are talking about it. Like, her husband, who's been a friend of mine since I was 17, I'll just say the name because it's a public, Jared Anderson. He wrote the song The Great I Am and a bunch of other songs. Anyway, Jared Anderson, I've been friends with him since I was 17. His wife, Megan, just came out about a situation that once came out, but it was shaped in a way that made it look like she was complicit in it, and it was abuse. It wasn't an affair. And so she came out about it this last week, and he's traveled. I mean, he was on the Promise Keepers tour, like back in the day. Like, he's been serving the church and churches and pastors for years. And this dropped, and pastors are just silent about it.
Wow.
And in talking with him, I was brokenhearted about it. I actually was leading a team towards an outreach class in an event, and we were doing our training last Sunday night, and I was broken up about it. I stopped him and said, I need you all to pray for wisdom for me in this. And because Jared was telling me, he's like, nobody's saying anything. I'm surprised by the silence. And I just got to a point where I was like, I can't not say something. And so I made a statement, and man, the amount of just anger and trying to protect and attack that hit myself and them this last week was them specifically, but I felt a piece of it. I was just like, man, I know what you went through. I filled out a police report when I was 25 about my abuse when I was 10, and like next to nobody stood with me. My own pastor told me not to do it because I would hurt the image of the church and that we need to just figure it out. And so I'm like, I can't not stand with you. And so a part of what I do is just, I'm like, I can't not say something. I'm a pastor I believe in Jesus's vision for the church, but I believe we're bombing it left and right. There's scandal left and right, abuse left and right. And if I don't say something, I'm complicit in it.
Yeah. The name of the podcast, you have to listen to it because it just so much of what you're saying just correlates. It's called Right Side Up Podcast with Daniel.
I've heard about that. Yeah.
I've never listened to her podcast before, but she's got a book coming out for pastors specifically on the subject you're talking about. And they interviewed 2 people on that podcast. But yeah, you have to listen to that because I think you'd really be able to relate to a lot of what was said.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the church that we were in for the first 12 years of our marriage, I went back there as part of my healing journey. And I ended up apologizing to that pastor. And then they said, well, why are you apologizing? I said, well, I'm just sorry that you had to put up with him for that long. That's all I could say was because I felt bad because he was always causing conflict, always causing fights with other members of the church. And I just felt like, I'm just going to do that. That's how I feel. So, but I didn't really ever hear much from any of the 4 that I told about the abuse, a little bit at the beginning. Because I did tell 4 pastors and a friend that I was getting beat up, and like a year or 2 into the marriage, they knew. And I felt like I had to wait till we cheated to leave. And that's why part of the reason I do what I do, because churches need to be educated in how to handle it. Because they never once again asked, are you still being beat up? Nope. Never. I just stayed married to him. So spiritual abuse is abuse and manipulation done in the name of Jesus. Can you expound on what spiritual abuse is? And can you share how greatly this impacts a person's faith?
Yeah. So spiritual abuse, the hard part, we've talked about how difficult it is to talk about and how people don't understand because it's a form. It could be emotional. It could be physical, sometimes in families, it could be sexual abuse, whatever it is. And it's within kind of the confines of a Christian environment. Oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes it's through the leadership or power that this abuse is done by. And oftentimes the response is one to protect power, and people feel controlled, they feel manipulated, they feel they're spoken down to, they're hurt by words, all kinds of stuff that happens. But then you add the piece of the faith piece in there. It's like, no, if it comes from a leader, this leader is put there and called by God. Therefore, you have the sense that if I speak against them, I'm speaking against God. And so the faith piece, already abuse. I mean, we don't even have to talk about the religious side of spiritual abuse. We know that it's destructive. But the minute that the faith component comes in, then you get confused because you're like, well, this person is of God. And if I question this, if I talk out loud about this, if I push on this, I'm questioning God. And then there's a piece of maybe it's God that did this. Maybe this is, and so you have kind of an off idea of who God is in this. And one of the hard things I found is when people walk through this alone, one of the hard pieces is kind of undoing what's intertwined between the abuse and theology and faith. I think those are kind of the big things where pretty much everybody I walk with, there is a moment where they have to let go for a moment or for a while or for good. They have to let go for their own healing journey, parts of what we would call, if we're Bible-believing Christians, oftentimes we have to, and this is a part of my own story, we have to let go of some of the things that other people would see as like essential doctrines because there's so much pain attached to them. And so that's why it gets so messy, is because outside of the fact that abuse is destructive, whether it's emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, you then have the intertwined piece of theology. And so that's why it's so destructive.
Yeah. Causes so much confusion. So what are some of the tactics of spiritual abuse? Is spiritual abuse something that can happen to you without even realizing it? And do you have any specific examples that you or someone you know experienced firsthand with spiritual abuse?
Yeah. So manipulation is a huge one. With that, you have a mixture of manipulating people potentially for the means of possibly a narcissistic leader. There's manipulation to get sometimes when you're working in those environments, there's manipulation to get a specific result out of the volunteers or the staff members that work for you. And that happens in secular type job environments, but it's unfortunate that the church is just as bad sometimes. And so you have that faith piece in there. There's a misuse of power oftentimes. And so it's kind of a sense of where people don't really have consent or agency to make decisions with that because of the power. There's a demand of obedience or unquestioning obedience oftentimes. And there's oftentimes a controlling of the narrative. And so I've seen oftentimes when I've worked in churches, I've seen if there's a disagreement between like the lead pastor and a staff member and they get fired, the story that's told isn't really true. I've seen people to save face of the church institution or the pastor. I've seen people publicly crucified and they're forced maybe to sign a non-disclosure agreement in that so they can't speak up. And so, yeah, to answer that, the second point, to tell some of the stories, I mean, I have a friend who was a pastor who, like I said, he was publicly crucified with a non-disclosure agreement in that where the story was told publicly that wasn't fully true in order to shame him, to kind of get past everything that was happening with him. Non-disclosure agreements, I'll say over and over, have no place in the church. And those are oftentimes hush money where somebody who has maybe been a victim of abuse or they're just in a toxic situation and they raise their hand and call it out and they're often let go with money or a severance package in return for their silence, and they sign an agreement for that.
I didn't even know that.
It's more common than not. And I continually, as I talk to people in all kinds of churches, more so in mega churches, but it is an extremely common practice. And then oftentimes the narrative shaped to where it's like, we received his resignation or whatever it is, you know? And so It's a very common practice, and you'll see me speak out about that pretty often.
So if you're going to a church and they want you to sign that, that's a big, huge red flag, like a non-disclosure agreement.
Yeah, and that's really tough because I tell people not to shame themselves if, like, let's say they're in a situation where it's like the only way I could survive or the only was if I signed that, so I signed it.
Yeah,
It's the only way that my friend, and so, but what it does is it silences their voices, and when you heal through abuse, that your voice and your agency is so important.
Yes.
What it does, it causes kind of a blockage in that ability.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
yeah.
Oh, I didn't know about that. That's interesting.
Yeah. And that's just one of many. I see financial pieces where there's coercion for giving, and I see that pretty common. One of the things that I'm personally against is forcing anybody, including staff, to tithe. Yeah. Because I think you rob the person of the ability to, as 2 Corinthians talks about, giving out of a cheerful heart.
Right,
definitely.
And so I'm against forced tithing even to staff. I once worked for a pastor who would look at everyone's giving statements in the church, and he would sometimes write letters to people and say, "Hey, I want to sit down with you. I don't think you're giving what I think is adequate for you to give." And so that's a huge form of abuse as well. You see that with financial stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, God's looking at our heart. Yeah. And I always feel like if my heart's not right with the giving, then I shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah.
My heart needs to be in the right place.
Yeah. It literally says God loves a cheerful giver.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So what is religious trauma syndrome, and what are some of the negative experiences that contribute to RTS, and what are some of the symptoms?
Yeah, let me zoom out for a minute and just say, and I'm sure you've talked about this multiple times on your podcast, especially with like Sanghoon and stuff, that we have the moment of abuse and we have the abuser, or that whole piece, but the trauma is how we process it. Mm-hmm. And so I know people that walk through the environment I was raised in that, to be honest with you, they seem unscathed compared to other people. Right. It's all in how we process it. And some of that has to do with how our caregivers raised us and how safe we felt with kind of a, attachment style and what we got from our caregivers, to be honest with you. So the trauma piece is how we process it. And so religious trauma syndrome is a term that's used, and unfortunately, it is not yet found in what's called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which that's how you basically diagnose kind of a mental disorder. It's not found in there. So there's certain people that are advocating for it. But to zoom out, before I zoom into the religious trauma piece, to zoom out, there still needs to be a lot more research around trauma. Because even PTSD, it found its way in the DSM in like 1980, I think it was. But it wasn't in the category of trauma or sensory disorder. And it wasn't until like 2013, and it was kind of on its own in this brand new category of trauma sensory disorder. And so there's around the concept of trauma, there's honestly not as much research as there needs to be. And so if you zoom into religious trauma, there really needs to be a lot more research. But with religious trauma that shares with PTSD is 4 different symptoms that if an individual has I think they diagnose it after the individual has had all 4, suffered with all 4 for at least a month. 2 of those we see shared pretty much with everyone we would say has religious trauma syndrome. One of those is kind of a hyperarousal. You get keyed up, you get dysregulated to the point where there's kind of an overreaction because of the dysregulation. So for me, I remember a time I was sitting in my grandparents' church. It was the first time I was in a church like this in years, and I was in the middle of the pews and I got keyed up and dysregulated and I was trapped and I freaked out. And so that's one of the things that shares with PTSD is when you're in a religious space, and oftentimes people don't even know what's happening to them in those spaces. The other one is a wrestling with belief and wrestling with like cognitive dissonance and what they believe about God. And as I've walked with victims of religious trauma, it's common that they will articulate to me something true about the goodness of God, but their body and their system won't actually allow them to believe it. And so that's very similar with PTSD, one of the symptoms of PTSD, but within religious trauma, we see that kind of cognitive dissonance. And because of that, it's a hard time. People have a hard time making their own decisions for things. And that's kind of the piece of processing and taking back agency. So there's quite a bit there. We see people that are affected by authoritarianism. We see all kinds of stuff. But people, when they process it in a way that a few of the symptoms are similar to PTSD, but it happened within the realm of a religious environment. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, lots of triggers. So what's the best way to handle someone who's been through pain and is experiencing spiritual trauma? What are things to avoid seeing?
Yeah, I tell people, I actually think I just had a post today. Basically, I tell people not to be Job's friends. They were fine until they opened their mouth to give advice.
Yeah, what not to do.
And so we do not know the mysteries of God, therefore, to say, well, maybe God's doing this, or to say, you know what, God's going to use your story. Sometimes people hear that as, God, you know, unfortunately, I'm going to be exploited by God for his own purposes. And so we got to be really, really careful what we say about what God is and isn't doing through a person's situation. People believe different things about the sovereignty and the control of God, but it doesn't matter that the person is going through pain and struggle. And in that, I think it's really, really important that we learn to empathize and sympathize. And so we could unintentionally kind of put ourselves in a place of being above the person and outside of what they're going through and trying to speak to them. Even unfortunately, with good intention, if we overuse the word, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, if we overuse that, sometimes it tells the person that you're not sitting with them. And so what I found, the people that I find that I feel are empathizing or sympathizing the best, and what I try to emulate, are ones where I say, man, that's really hard. Man, that's really, and you almost share in the feeling in which they're feeling. I think that that's some of the difference between something that allows you to feel safe for somebody, as opposed to, people have really good intentions when they give advice. I'm not questioning their intentions, but I'm saying that it could actually cause a blocking in the person's healing process because of the sense of safety. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because safety is so important.
Yeah.
Saying we went over that. We went over that a lot.
Yeah, and we always think we have to say all these words, where just like Jesus gave the example of just weeping with, you know, sometimes if you don't even know what to say, but just showing that you really care is enough for someone to feel heard.
So I'm interested in this question. So, and I think this is important for our listeners. So what is Jesus's response to abusive religious leaders?
Yeah, I think Matthew 23 is probably the most focused words that Jesus has. I mean, we see all over. I mean, he's driving them out of the temple for, you know, abusing people and oppressing people, driving up the costs of livestock, all those things. He drives them out of the temple. But in Matthew 23, he has all the woe to yous to the religious leaders, you know, woe to you, teachers, hypocrites. And then he just starts listening to some things. So the one that I see that correlates so well with this question is where he says, you slam the door of the kingdom in people's faces. And I really do believe that Jesus is saying, like, hey, I want people to experience the fullness of the kingdom of God, but you are making it impossible for them. And you see that a couple other times. Like he says, you know, beware the yeast of the Pharisees. Well, that's the way in which they interpret and live out the law. Jesus was very focused on making sure that people who were sick and dying and in need of a savior and knew it and didn't think they were above it, that they experienced the full love and compassion of God. And we'll see over and over. I mean, you just look at the Gospels over and over, and the religious leaders felt like they were above everyone else. And I think that we see in our day and age with religious leaders that sense of like, I'm above this. I'm the called one of God. And what they did, they missed Jesus, they protected their power, and they oppressed people that Jesus was offering compassion and love to. So, yeah.
Yeah, when they're supposed to be leading us into the fullness of the glory of the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember, and I've spoken about this too. Ezekiel 34 talks about it's God, before Jesus, he's bringing judgment and speaking judgment on the Jewish leaders that were called to shepherd God's people. And he's like, you've scattered the flock and wolves are getting them and all this stuff. And then he promises, he says, I will come and I will gather my sheep and I will tend to them. He says this in Ezekiel 34. So there's this moment in John 10 where Jesus is in Jerusalem with his disciples for the festival of dedication, which we call Hanukkah. And what they would have had in the synagogues for their public reading that day is Ezekiel 34. And so he uses this moment as he's walking through, and you have religious leaders there, and he says at this moment, he's like, I am the good shepherd. And so he makes that statement to say, I'm the one that's been promised. But there's a moment where he talks about hired hands, and he says the hired hands, when trouble comes, they flee because they're only looking for themselves. Mm. And I think that that's a huge testament to those, first of all, who are shepherd-minded people in the way of Jesus. That he says here, the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. But the problem is when victims of spiritual abuse come up, we, instead of laying down ourselves and our lives and even the name of the institution or whatever that we're trying to protect, instead of laying that down for the sake of the victim, we crucify the victim.
Yeah.
Because we care more about ourselves. And so we sit in kind of the space of the hired hand that God is speaking judgment to. And so Jesus, he says in Mark 9, as he's talking about, he says, anybody who harms these children that he's loving on, it's like, it's better that, you tie a weight around their neck and plunge them into the bottom of the sea. So Jesus cares about those who are forgotten and oppressed that the religious leaders are oppressing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of sad. And like a lot of times, at least I hear, because I haven't been super involved in anything, but they're so business minded that they forget about, it just becomes a business and no longer the love. And so I just try to focus on having a relationship with God and being in his presence. And then I still am in the church and part of the church. But yeah, I've heard a lot of that's going on behind the scenes in churches. It just becomes a business. And we forgot about about God.
Yep. And then you're protecting the institution and the voice of God, so to speak, not within that institution. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is a healthy way to address emotional avoidance?
Yeah.
To be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 2. You don't want to miss it.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.